Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. Following the truth wherever it leads. Exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites. Revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard.
Kali Kachali. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Or Kale Kachali. Regardless, Kali Kachali or Cal Kachali tweets, "Thanks, Richard. I love your show. Always wait for your podcasts every week, all the way from Nairobi, Kenya." So I thought it was appropriate we send a little love out to Kali Kachali in Nairobi. Thanks for listening. And welcome to the Audio Imaginarium and the Conspiracy Show. My name, of course, Richard Syrett. Regular listeners to this program are familiar with my media scientist friend Nelson Thal, archivist, the official archivist for the late Marshall McLuhan. And Nelson's a regular contributor. We began a new segment with Nelson here on the Conspiracy Show. It's called State Secrets. And one of the things that Nelson is very fond of saying, you might even call it his catchphrase, is, "We are standing on the shoulders of giants," which is, of course, sort of a paraphrase of a quote from Sir Isaac Newton, who said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." In other words, Newton was simply stating that he was building on previous discoveries, primarily the ancient scholars of Rome and Greece. Standing on the Shoulders of Giants is the name of the fourth studio album by English rock band Oasis, which was released on 28th of February 2000. Well, tonight on the Conspiracy Show, you're going to hear a lot about giants. We're not talking about the album by Oasis or Isaac Newton. I'm not talking about the football team from New York or the baseball team from San Francisco. I'm talking about the monsters of human appearance, but prodigious size and strength common in the mythology and legends of many different cultures. There are also accounts, of course, of giants in the Old Testament, most famously Goliath. Attributed to them are extraordinary strength and physical proportions. Now, you may know about giants from fairy tales, such as Jack the Giant Killer, which have really formed our modern perception of giants as stupid and violent monsters, sometimes said to eat humans, especially children, though this is actually a confusion with ogres, which are distinctly cannibalistic. But we're not talking about fairy tales tonight. My guest is here to shatter the mainstream academic teachings on the subject of giants and take us all on an exciting journey of discovery. For example, it may shock, surprise, perhaps even delight you to learn that thousands of giant skeletons have been unearthed at Mound Builder sites across North America, only to disappear from the historical record, and that North America was once ruled by an advanced race of giants. You heard me correctly. But wait, it gets better. We're also about to learn how the Smithsonian has been actively suppressing the physical evidence for nearly 150 years. Richard J. Dewhurst is the author of The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, The Missing Skeletons, and the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up. Richard is the Emmy Award-winning writer of the HBO feature documentary Dear America, Letters Home from Vietnam. He's a graduate of NYU with degrees in journalism, film, and television. He's written and edited for the History Channel, A&E, PBS, Fox, and ABC News. He lives in the Green Mountain State, beautiful Vermont. And if that's not enough, he's got a pretty fine first name, and if I do say so. Richard Dewhurst, welcome aboard the Conspiracy Show. How are you?
I'm very good, Richard, and it's a real pleasure to be on your show. Love your introduction.
The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America. Now, I understand you're kind of a tall glass of water yourself. Is that why you're interested in giants?
Well, that's how it started. Yep, I'm 6'6", and, it became a fascination of mine when I became tall, and over the years as a journalist and a documentary filmmaker, I began a little Fortean file of giant stories, and whenever I ran across them, I would file it away, and generally they were anecdotal or at most a capsulized reference to some find. And several years ago, I decided I was going to get to the bottom of the thing, so I subscribed to a couple of online newspaper archive services, and they covered hundreds of years of newspaper reports, primarily in the United States. And with the help of word search, I all of a sudden began to uncover hundreds of giant stories. And by the time I got done researching state historical archives, I had giant stories in every state in the Union. Well-sourced, authentic, museum involvement, and often with the Smithsonian, either at the front end or at the back end, requiring the skeletons to be sent there, only to disappear from history.
Well, you mentioned newspaper accounts, and I recall reading, I believe it might have been the New York Herald or might have even been the Times, talking about these skeletons unearthed at what are referred to as these Mound Builder sites back in the 19th century sometimes. And people dismiss those accounts. They say, well, that was back in the day when yellow journalism reigned supreme across the land, and the New York Herald and so forth, they were more like today's National Enquirer. So the fact that they appeared in newspaper accounts, do we necessarily take that at face value, or what's the next step from there?
And as I said, I mean, I had literally hundreds of these articles, and I winnowed through them for specifically articles that had references to major museums, universities, professors, or multiple witnesses in a town. And once I began compiling them, there was a certain internal consistency to the accounts that became very hard to ignore. The burial customs would be the same. The kind of artifacts that are found in association with the mound builders were very specific, and I tried to include them in the book so that you could see that these weren't just made-up stories of some giant somewhere. And perhaps one of the most surprising things in my research was a quote I ran across from Abraham Lincoln in 1848. And he was making a speech up in your neck of the woods at Niagara Falls. And the exact quote is, "The eyes of that species of extinct giant, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now." And that's an amazing quote. That's jaw-dropping. I've never heard that attributed to Abraham Lincoln. That's remarkable. Yep. And it's remarkable, A, because it's Abraham Lincoln. It's remarkable, B, because it indicates how widespread this knowledge in the 19th century was. We were an agrarian society. We were moving west. We were plowing the fields, and everywhere these bones were turning up, and it was common knowledge. When you start to read the articles that I've compiled in here, you see that there's a real familiarity on the part of the writers often, that this is not an uncommon occurrence. Another reason the quote is amazing is that a huge giant city was found on the Ontario border of the United States in Dunnville on the Grand River. Yes, not too far from my hometown, Brantford. And not only did they find multiple giants, but they found houses with chimneys and a blacksmith shop with 2 tons of charcoal and evidence of gold and silver work. Well, before we get into, how the Smithsonian or how Orthodox academia has suppressed this information, because, that's pretty amazing how you hide something this large. But let's take a few moments and talk about what we mean by giants. When I think of giants, and many of us, we learned in Sunday school about David versus Goliath, or Moses sending his spies, Joshua, into Canaan and discovering giants and so forth. What are we talking about? The same kind of giants here? Yeah, we are. As far as I've been able to figure out, Goliath in the Bible was supposed to be 11 feet tall. We have numerous 10 to 12 foot finds. The cutoff I'm using primarily in the book is 7 feet. And I would say that over half the finds are between 7 and 9 feet. And then there are 12-foot finds all the way from Minnesota to Louisiana out west. Come again. Did you say 12 feet? Pardon me? Did you say 12 feet? 12 feet. My word. And then there's one very credible find that was made on the Indiana-Ohio border of a giant 18 feet tall. It was witnessed by all the townspeople. It was attested to by the mayor and the local physician, and it was found in association with a 9-foot sword and an iron helmet that the writer characterized as resembling an Assyrian-made helmet from Nineveh. And in that case, the bones were sent to New York and disappeared again. But
you're a journalist. I am. You're an Emmy Award-winning writer. You've worked for ABC News. You've written for the Miami Herald.
Right.
When this information is, this is the stuff that can get you laughed out of a newsroom pretty quickly. How did you deal with this information, and did you share it with your colleagues?
Yes, and everyone thought I was nuts. To put it in a nutshell, I started saying you wouldn't believe the kind of credible articles I'm reading here about giants, and they'd say, "Oh, it's ridiculous. Who says who? Prove it. I don't believe a word you're saying. It's malarkey. So finally, I decided, well, in order to make the book credible and for people to have an opportunity to read what I'm reading, I'm going to compile these articles, and you can make up your mind for yourself.
And you've done a pretty fine job, Richard. The ancient giants who ruled America, the missing skeletons, and the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up. More of my conversation with Richard J. Dewhurst on the other side. Stay with us.
The truth goes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
When I was 12, for Christmas, I received my first copy of the Guinness World Book of Records. And I was fascinated by the life and times of Robert Wadlow, who was also known as the Alton Giant, or the Illinois Giant, who is the tallest man in medical history, up until, of course, we met Richard Dewhurst. But Robert Wadlow was 8 feet 11 and a half inches. Now, the poor fella, he needed braces, leg braces, in order to walk. He never used a wheelchair, but he had braces because he had very little feeling in his legs or his feet. He had autoimmune disease. He died when he was 22, always rather sickly, despite his tremendous height. But imagine thousands of Robert Wadlows, healthy Robert Wadlows, roaming the North American continent and ruling the land. This is the subject of Richard Dewhurst's book, The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, The Missing Skeletons, and the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up. So let's get back to what these giants looked like again, Richard. Now, these were, well, first of all, they're found primarily in these mound burial sites. Let's take a few moments and explain what mound burial sites are.
Well, the Smithsonian itself estimates that in the United States there were several 100,000 mounds, and it required the work of millions of people. And this mound culture was pervasive all the way across North America. As a matter of fact, it's worldwide. We can get into that later, but it reached its apogee and fell somewhere around 1200 to 1400 A.D. And subsequent to that, we have then the Indians that we're so familiar with. But throughout all the research I did and all the interviews that were conducted with the Indians, when asked about the mounds and various other anomalous ancient walls, dams, all kinds of things, the Indians always said, we didn't do this. The giants did. And this was, constantly dismissed as, aboriginal savages with, childish viewpoints and all these, dismissive Victorian epithets that we've all heard. But in fact, the Mound Builder culture was highly sophisticated, and within all these mounds, generally, you find a royal burial of a giant or multiple giants. And they're often covered in copper crowns, copper armor, copper and mica jewelry, copper bracelets, sophisticated grave goods. This was not a savage culture at all. As a matter of fact, constantly in the reports, it refers to the higher degree of craftsmanship associated with the remains found in these mounds.
Did the native North Americans at that time, did they fear the giants? Did they war with them?
The only account that I really found of, by and large, most of the observations about the Mound Builder culture, they always note that there are not defensive ramparts. They don't really appear. They appear to have been in a pastoral, agricultural society. Many of the mounds were what was called effigy mounds, which are pictorial mounds. And in certain parts of the country, especially in the Midwest and a huge amount of them, surprisingly, up in Wisconsin, the landscape was literally covered with these things. Deer, birds, lizards, mastodons, elephants, people, crosses. Literally, the landscape was cultivated in a highly sacred manner, it seems. Now, on the other hand, there are stories there's a story of a giant war that involved the Lenape Indians and the Menengwe, and the story says that the Lenape were originally out west, and as a result of a volcanic disaster, they were forced to move east, and when they came across the Mississippi River, they engaged with the Allegwe Indians, which was another race of giants, and engaged in an epic battle. And then another giant tribe called the Menengwe got involved, and they defeated the Allegwe. They went south, and the Lenape eventually settled in the New York, Delaware area, and certain remnants of them were around up to the time of the settlers.
So what happened to them? Where did they all go? If there were, do we have a handle on how many there were?
And there was a collapse of the Mound Builder culture, and the various Indian accounts refer to natural disasters and also some sort of plague of some kind. And I don't speculate in the book, but there was the Black Plague around that time, and we often think of the Mongols as only going in one direction. I'm beginning to think that they invaded both east and west and brought with them a disease that brought an end to civilization.
You mentioned a number of different races. Do we have a handle on how many races? There are reports of giants worldwide. So, how many races might there have been, and what kind of a population are we talking about?
Well, that's, there are giant burial sites all the way from the Canadian border. I unfortunately didn't have access to Canadian newspapers. I'm sure I would have had a ton of articles about that. But there's, in Cuyahoga, New York, they found 200 giant skeletons, and they range from 7 to 9 feet. Out on the west coast, in Catalina Island, Professor Ralph Glidden, who was the curator of the Catalina Museum in the 1920s, he found 3,781 skeletons on Catalina alone and over 5,000 on the Channel Islands. And those averaged 7 feet, and the tallest was a king that they exhumed that was 9'2". In Ohio and Minnesota, we have burial grounds with 8-foot queens. One, she was buried face down. The king, who was 9'4", was buried on top of her face up. And then in an associated series of 8 other mounds, they found 7 9-footers and 1 10-footer, and a 18-pound stela of sandstone with hieroglyphs on it. All this, is well documented.
When I mentioned Robert Wadlow, the Alton giant,
he had a pituitary problem. He had a tumor on his pituitary gland. That's gigantism, the disease. These bones do not show any signs of disease at all.
Right, because today, I mean, it's a statistical, anomaly, and usually, as you say, there's a pituitary issue there, and these individuals that reach that height rarely live that long. They have heart problems and so forth. I mean,
well, one of the things that's extraordinary about the accounts, and I think just cursory going through the book, you'll notice that account after account, people are saying that the lower jaw was so big I could put it over my head, and that the bones seem to be thicker than those of modern humans. Again, I don't speculate in the book, but it seems to me that we're probably talking about Cro-Magnon man here.
And are there accounts of superhuman strength to go along with these 12-foot or 9-foot frames?
Well, there's Indian accounts where they refer to their giant ancestors having the ability to pluck trees out at their roots or pick up boulders and throw them, but they're mostly anecdotal.
You would imagine, though, that a race of giants would have been able to sort of have their way. I just would have assumed that they would have been, fierce and tremendous warriors, and yet I guess it was the plague that finally was their undoing. Well,
it seems that they probably were so prepossessing that no one wanted to really mess around with them. So instead, we have a very pastoral picture of huge earthworks all over the place with no defensive ramparts. On the other hand, a lot of the giants are found with copper armor. There's several instances in Ohio and Indiana where they found groups of these giants, all with copper helmets, copper nose pieces, copper epaulets, copper bronze pieces covering their chests, swords, and hardened copper implements. And
right.
Again, it mystifies the people that have found these because the copper that they're talking about is hardened in such a way that it has the strength of tempered steel almost.
Well, we're beginning to learn about this huge copper operation that was going along the shores of Lake Superior and I believe Lake Michigan.
Correct.
That may have been the main supply of copper for what fueled the Bronze Age in Europe. Now, how they got that copper over to Europe, I can't imagine. But perhaps it was primarily these giants that were doing the mining.
Well, the copper mines in the Keweenaw Peninsula, and that's the northern peninsula in Michigan, and most especially Isle Royale, which I find has a very interesting name to it.
Isle Royale, yes.
Island.
Yes.
It's literally an island of copper, and because of a geologic anomaly that upturned the copper and exposed it to the open air, the sulfur impurities burned off. So this copper is over 99% pure, and they estimate that 1.5 billion tons of copper were taken out of there over a 10,000-year period, and they can't account for any of it outside of the burial finds in the Americas, which is only a small fraction. And when you start putting all the other pieces together, it becomes pretty clear that this copper was probably a secret source of the copper that was being sent over to Europe.
Imagine the size of ships that would have been required. And this is, maybe 1,000 years before Columbus?
There are related finds. I don't go into the book because I'm dealing with giants in this book, but up in that area, especially around Thunder Bay, Isle Royale, there's reports of megalithic dock remains. In some of the articles I have in there, there's evidence of dams that indicate that there was sea trade that went east through the St. Lawrence Seaway and then also down the Mississippi. There's a huge earthworks on the northern Louisiana border called Poverty Point that's recently been part of the World Heritage. Some estimates say there's 100,000 people there, and they've found these anomalous cooking balls and these other things that they couldn't quite explain, and some people are now beginning to think that they were taking the copper from Michigan during the summer and bring it down there and make it into copper trading hides, and then from there exporting it.
Richard J. Dewhurst is the author of The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, The Missing Skeletons and the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up, and we'll get into the actual cover-up aspect in just a few moments. We have a break coming up, but I want to ask you, I believe it was the editor of Ancient American magazine, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he was telling me, and you can sort of, I guess, separate the wheat from the chaff here, the idea that the traditional Native American or Native Canadian greeting, where they would, an Indian would raise the palm of his hand outwards and would say "how," the idea was that the purpose of that is to count the fingers on somebody's hand, because if they had 6 fingers, that meant that they belonged to this race of giants, and that the idea that these giants had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each. Anything in there resembling the truth?
In all the accounts that I compiled, I didn't run across one account of 6 fingers and 6 toes, although I did run across multiple accounts of what's called double dentition.
What does that mean?
Which is 2 rows of teeth.
2 rows of teeth.
Mm-hmm. And multiple accounts of 2 rows of teeth. I don't discount maybe 6 fingers, but I didn't turn up any in my research.
All right, let's break away here for a moment. When we come back, let's sort out how the Smithsonian and other museums have been able to keep a lid on this for 150 years. Back with more of my conversation with Richard J. Dewhurst. Don't go away.
As you're staring up at the night sky, ever wonder who's staring back? You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Welcome back. I'm joined by Richard J. Dewhurst, author of The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, The Missing Skeletons and the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up. And I'm just looking at some photos, and some of these I'm sure have graced some of the the grocery store tabloids, and it's difficult to say whether these have been photoshopped or which ones are legitimate. But I mean, how do we when looking at photographs, sort of make that determination? I mean, have you satisfied that, that there are fairly recent photos of unearthed giant skeletons?
Boy, well, with Photoshop era, it becomes very problematic. And I can tell you, after World War II, the reports of giant finds virtually disappeared in my research, except for a couple that came up. The conspiracy itself can be traced back to the first time they established the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian, which was in 1879, and Major John Wesley Powell, who was a very famous Western explorer, was put as the head of it because he had experience out west. And he established what was called the Powell Doctrine. And the Powell Doctrine said that there was absolutely no proof of any contact pre-Columbus at all in the Americas, that what we were looking at was not any thing to do with high culture. These people were aborigines, savages. Anything that indicated writing was just childish scribbles. And once that was put in place, then the universities fell into line. And the Smithsonian was based also on the concept of evolution, and that was the cornerstone of the institution. And as you know, if you've seen those pictures that we all saw in school, man is always getting bigger and smarter.
Right.
So you can't have giants messing up their main scientific tenet. And then when Powell died in 1903, a man called Ailes Hadrika, whose name I have a real problem pronouncing, but he took over, and he was the man that came up with the Bering Land Bridge theory, that all the Indians in the Americas came across from Asia by way of Alaska and through Canada. In the book 1491, they estimate that Ailes Hadrika himself took over 30,000 skeletons into the Smithsonian archives, boxed them, did not examine them, and filed them away. Because basically any proof of red-haired, blonde-haired giants brings up the whole question of European contact.
Right, right.
And so, again, you're going to blow an academic career out of the water.
Well, if there's one thing I've learned doing this show and speaking with people like yourself, and that is that Columbus wasn't first, he was probably last.
My research indicates that just about everybody was over here.
Right.
The amount of finds in association with the mounds include stelas with the Ten Commandments, hieroglyphs, Roman coins, evidence of China, India, Iberia. It just goes on and on and on.
So back to how they suppress this. So what happens when someone unearths one of these mass graves or a skeleton, the skeletal remains of someone, let's say a 12-foot giant, and he takes it off to the local museum? I mean, how vast was this conspiracy? Was every museum curator and director put on notice that if anything like this comes in, bury it?
Well, you'll get quotes from right after the discovery, of very reputable state museum directors and even the Smithsonian in several instances saying this is one of the most significant finds we've ever encountered. We hope to study this more, and we're going to let you know more about it. And then nothing.
Are there any remains on display anywhere?
The closest thing I found was out in Nevada, the finds at the Lovelock Cave. And those were discovered by state workers that were dispatched there, two archaeologists named Wheeler, a husband and wife team. And they were excavating bat guano out of the cave, and underneath that they found 4 giants. And those skulls were then kept within the State Museum system in Nevada. But because of the NAGPRO laws, which we can get into, they are prohibited from exhibiting them. And this is common in many of the cases. The NAGPRO laws were passed in 1990, and it's the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. And essentially, it says that any time ancient bones are found in the vicinity of an Indian tribe, they belong to the Indian tribe, and they're handed over and reburied, and there's no display of them. It was a Mound Builder burial site 90 miles south of Peoria. This man, Don Dixon, he discovered them on his farm. He was digging in 1928, I think, and started uncovering skeletons, contacted the University of Chicago, one of the most reputable universities, and they helped him examine the site. They determined that there was 3,000 to 4,000 skeletons there. He only exposed 250 of them, left them in situ, and then built an exhibit around it, and it had 75,000 visitors a year. In 1990, when the NAGPRO laws were passed, the exhibit was closed down and then reopened without any bones, and hardly anyone goes to visit.
Sounds like the NAGPRO laws were a nice, convenient cover for those that want to keep.
That's been suggested.
All right, I got to take a time out. We'll come back and continue our discussion, Richard. The ancient giants who ruled America, right here on the Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
It's time to redefine reality. This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Just keep hearing Red Barber's immortal voice in my head. The Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. Boy, you imagine a team of giants? They would have.
Well, I suggest to people that the common knowledge is that there were giants in New York State attributed to the name the New York Giants.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
And as an adjunct to what I was saying about the NAGPRO laws, the other problem that we have here is that the mound builders are not officially recognized by the federal government as an indigenous Indian tribe.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Because nobody's ever stepped forward and said, I'm a descendant of the mound builders, therefore give them protection. I often joke that either Conan O'Brien or Bill Walton should step forward.
That's right.
Because we should get Conan,
Well, they had red hair primarily, didn't they?
They have red hair. They're like over 6'5". That qualifies,
Well, that begs the question. What would have happened? Where are the descendants? Why don't we have relatively, healthy 7.5, 8 foot? Well, we do have 7.5 footers, in the NBA and so forth. But where are the 8, 9 foot tall, healthy descendants of these giants?
Well, again, as I said, there's some of the accounts, indicate that these are totally the same as us, except over 7 feet tall. But there's a huge amount of these accounts, where they talk about the large lower jaw, the extra thickness of the skulls, the overdevelopment of the leg bones that seem to indicate to me that as I said earlier, that they perhaps may be the last of the Cro-Magnons.
Of course, the Bible refers to these giants as the Nephilim, sort of the descendants of the commingling of the fallen angels with the daughters of men.
Right.
What do you think of that?
I have to put some credence to it because of the physical evidence I've seen. I in the book, I include a quote from Numbers where they talk about going into a strange foreign land where the sons of Anak were, and they come of giants, and it says, we stood before them as grasshoppers. And I think it's very interesting. The sons of Anak is very similar to the Anunnaki of the Sumerian legend.
Interesting, yeah.
Who were the gods. And then it's also very similar to the Anastasi, who are the ancient ones of the referred to as the builders of the cliff dwellings out in Arizona. And also in the copper culture, the ancient ones up there have a very similar designation. So this Anak, Anu, Ana, seems to be Scythian, possibly tribe of Dan.
There's got to be so many of these skeletons still undiscovered. And, when someone unearths one, now, with the proliferation of obviously, cell phones and cameras and so forth, how can they continue to keep a lid on this?
Well, I think once people become aware of the fact that this is a reality and it's not some sort of fantasy, then one of the things I try to include in the book is very precise physical descriptions of where these finds were located, exactly, where on the river, whose farm it was, and so on and so forth. And I think these days, as you say, with YouTube and videos and everything else, if people become aware they're living in one of these areas and open their eyes to the fact that these mounds may still be around, I'm hoping that they're going to start discovering them. On the other hand, the federal government, I had a friend who lived in a ranch out in California that had been identified as an Indian archaeological site, and he was visited twice a year by federal inspectors to make sure he wasn't doing any digging on his property. So,
oh, that's interesting. And he has a mound on his property?
He had mounds and metates and other things that were actually laying around on the surface, and he never dug anywhere because he was too intimidated. I think if people are going to find these things, they're going to have to find them without the cooperation of the authorities.
Do you know, have you been in contact with, giant hunters, people that are interested in actually excavating these sites?
No, but I'm hoping as a result of the book that that's one of the things that comes out of it.
I asked you earlier about how you started on this journey, and but how did it change your life? I mean, as you had those aha moments, and I'm not exactly sure what they were on the road, but once you had those aha moments, I mean, how did that change your life? Did it turn?
I felt like I had just fallen down the rabbit hole, literally, like an Alice in Wonderland. I would get done with my day's research, and sometimes I would just sit there with my mouth hanging up. And there was a period of time for several weeks where I would wake up the next morning and remember what I had discovered the day before and say, no, this is just, But then it just kept mounting up and mounting up. And it finally got to a point where I just was flabbergasted. And, and asking myself the same questions you're asking me. I mean, how is this possible? And, there's finds in the 20th century that have been completely erased that you would think would have made it to our time, the Catalina finds being one of them, which is an incredible story. Another giant skull was found down in Texas in 1930. It was called the biggest skull ever discovered. Ale Cedrica from the Smithsonian was involved. It was found by a WPA dig in association with the University of Texas. The pictures are in my book. It was front page news. The finds out in Catalina, which was from 1918 to 1930, were conducted by Professor Ralph Glidden, who was the curator of the Catalina Museum. The island was owned by the Wrigley family at the time. He identified 4 burial sites on Catalina itself. The one he excavated, he took out 3,781 skeletons, averaging 7 foot, tallest 9'2".
My word.
He also
3,000
found
skeletons.
a megalithic temple. And this was front page. I reproduced a Sunday supplement front page in the book, but it was international news. And this was in the 1920s, 1930, and completely disappeared. I lived out in California for 25 years, had a great interest in Indians, read all of everything I could about it, never heard a word about it.
It's a wonderful example, a testament to the power of whatever you want to call these individuals, these elites, I guess the gatekeepers that control.
Well, and the most amazing thing about the Catalina finds is that 2 or 3 years ago, the museum changed hands in the 50s and became the Catalina Island Museum. And they were researching an exhibit on World War II, and one of the curators found several boxes in the storage thing with the name Glidden on it, and took them out, and lo and behold, they found all of this, documentation and so on and so forth. The Los Angeles Times wrote an article about it, but in the article and in the other articles, they refer to Glidden as a crackpot amateur archaeologist, when in fact he was the curator of the museum, and he was also the director of the Hay Foundation, which was part of the Smithsonian. And then I show that the Smithsonian has in their own archives over 500 pictures of his discoveries, and the Fowler Museum in UCLA apparently has 200 skeletons.
Unbelievable. I'm coincidentally, I'm heading down to Washington next week. I'm just, if I were to walk into the Smithsonian, slip somebody a couple of Franklins or something, I don't know. I mean, do they still have these things, in a warehouse somewhere or in the back shelves, and maybe they want to, look at it themselves, but they keep it away from the public? Are they still?
Well, I think there are individuals at the Smithsonian right now that are trying to pressure the institution into acknowledging the wider spans of American history vis-a-vis the Clovis and Solutrean arrow points they found. We're getting dates now of 14,000 B.C. It's throwing all of this land bridge theory into complete disrepute because Canada was a complete glacier. We're talking that far back. And curiously enough, last week the Smithsonian announced that they had just completed digs on Santa Rosa Island, which is one of the Channel Islands that Glidden had excavated. And they found 19 sites there, and they've identified occupation up to 10,000 B.C. and the use of boats. Now, as you know, the land bridge theory says they were too stupid to have boats. But as I always say, how smart do you have to be? A log falls in a river, and you jump on top of it, and you got a boat, right?
There you go. Listen, just final parting question here, and that is, you mentioned, falling down the rabbit hole, but and where do you go from here? After this is, after you discover that there was this race of giants wandering around North America, what do you do as a follow-up, Richard?
Well, I've been compiling quite a bit of information on Mexico, Central America, and South America, and it appears to continue the same story there. I have amazing newspaper accounts from these areas. Just recently in Ecuador, they announced that they discovered something called the Pyramid of the Giants there. And I've seen some YouTube video of it. In Teotihuacan, which is the pyramid complex there, the legends say that they were built by the giants. And there's a case that I'm investigating about one of the first women Harvard archaeologists. She started doing digs in the mountains behind Teotihuacan and was coming up with extraordinary finds. And she was literally discredited and run out of her profession. So,
it sounds like this has forever changed the trajectory of your life, or am I overstating things?
Yeah, I have to say that in the last couple of years I've had to rethink practically everything I know about American history and mythology.
Amazing story. Amazing story. The ancient giants who ruled America, the missing skeletons, and the Great Smithsonian Cover-Up. Richard, thank you so much for spending some time with me tonight, and congratulations.
Well, giant thanks, Richard. It was a pleasure talking to you.
All right, Richard J. Oh, by the way, where can we get the book?
It's available on Amazon. It's #1 right now on Amazon and Kindle for both archaeology and controversial knowledge. Also, Barnes & Noble and international book-selling sites all have it.
All right. Thank you again.
All righty.
Richard.
Take care.
Richard J. Dewhurst. All right. My website, back up and online after several weeks, and I hope you can visit it, richardsarrett.com. Hey, while you're there, subscribe to the newsletter, as yet unnamed, and as soon as I get sort of the critical mass number of subscribers, I will start rolling out that weekly newsletter free to you. Also, say hello on Twitter at Richard Sarrett, and of course, as always, follow the truth.
Richard Sarrett's Strange Planet. Following the truth wherever it leads. Exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites. Revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard.
Thank you for your ears, ladies and gentlemen. A writer with the Washington Post called 2013 the year that proved your paranoid friends were right. Vindication of a sort for those of you who listen to programs like this, those of you who don't run with the herd, those of you who recognize that the world is being pulled over our eyes. So I got to thinking, what will 2014 be? Keeping in mind, of course, it's early, but let's do one better than the Washington Post, shall we? Let's go out on a limb. 2014 may be the year we stopped calling conspiracists tinfoil hat-wearing weirdos. Every week, every day, seems to provide further vindication for us tinfoil types. Vindication. Yes, vindication, but at the same time, it's kind of hard to feel good about the fact that people are starting to wake up from a dream only to realize we're living in a nightmare. Or as Roger Zelazny, a science fiction writer, wrote, "Don't wake me up for the end of the world unless it has very good special effects." But just when you thought the end of the world had been called off, hooray! Along comes a lot of chatter online and in certain alternative news quarters about a relatively rare astronomical phenomenon known as the blood moon. And if you're not aware, a blood moon is a total lunar eclipse, sometimes called the hunter's moon. And a lunar eclipse occurs when the Earth's shadow, or the umbra, falls on the moon. So if the Earth's shadow completely covers the moon, it's a total eclipse. But a partial lunar eclipse happens if the Earth's umbra only partially covers the moon. And because the Earth has an atmosphere that bends light around its edge, the Earth's umbra is not completely dark. So the totally eclipsed moon will reflect the color of the light contained in the Earth's shadow, which happens to be the longer wavelength light, red, orange, yellows. And this is why sunsets, sunrises, generally are red, and why most lunar eclipses are red, which is a rather laborious explanation of why we sometimes call a totally eclipsed moon a blood moon. But it's not just one blood moon that's causing all this chatter. We're staring 4 blood moons in the face. 4 blood moons heading our way, and more importantly, the fact that these 4 blood moons all fall on the Jewish feast days of Passover and Sukkot in 2014 and then in 2015. So for some, people like author Mark Blitz and Pastor John Hagee, these blood moons, these total lunar eclipses, are much more than just an astronomical event. They are a fulfillment of the prophecy in Joel of the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood, and suggests that they may presage the second coming of the Lord, the second coming. And of course, before the second coming, we have the rise of the Antichrist and the tribulation, 3.5 years of hell on earth. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and notable day of the Lord come. So I thought to myself, who can I bring onto the program to help make sense of the 4 blood moons? And I didn't actually have to look far, because just last week, we were hoisting a few cups of cheer together as part of my 50th birthday. So he's a longtime friend and supporter of The Conspiracy Show, a pretty solid guy in my books. Ali Siadatan is an avid researcher of topics relating to the Bible. He teaches spiritual study courses for seekers, focusing on world religions and specializing in Old and New Testament studies. His research into UFOs and alien abductions led to the making of the very popular documentary UFOs, Angels, and Gods, which can be viewed at thinkagainproductions.com. Great pleasure to welcome Ali Siadatan to The Conspiracy Show. Hey, Ali, how are you?
Hi, Richard. Very fine, thank you. Good to be here.
All right, so I, in my very awkward and clumsy manner, tried to explain from an astronomical point of view what these blood moons are. And obviously I brought you on to talk more about the prophetic angle here. But again, just to make sure that I got it right and we're clear, we have these total eclipses, which are relatively rare, a total lunar eclipse. But we've got 2 happening this year on Passover and Sukkot, correct?
Yes.
And then again in 2015, one on Passover and Sukkot.
Yes, and the 2015, the first day of the Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah, begins with an eclipse of the sun as well. So we've got an eclipse of the sun, and we have 2 eclipses of the moon falling on the feast days, as you mentioned, yes.
Why are we paying such attention to these? I'm assuming that we've had blood moons in the past, since recorded history.
Right.
They're not, unheard of. They are somewhat rare. But so why are we looking at these next 4 blood moons?
Yeah, we've had lots of them. If you go on NASA's website, you can see about 5,000 years worth of them. Mathematically, they calculate backwards to see the exact date of these lunar and solar eclipses. Why is it important? Well, because in the Bible, God establishes a calendar. And he then appoints specific days on this calendar, days that are important to him. These are the feast days. If you go back to the very beginning of the Bible, to Genesis chapter 1, it talks about the sun and the moon, and then it says this enigmatic sentence that follows, the purpose of the sun and the moon. It says that they're there to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. Now, days and years is very obvious. It's the rotation of the earth around itself and around the sun, the biological clock that underlies all life processes is ignited. But let's focus on these 2 words, signs and seasons. When you think of the word sign, the Hebrew word for it is ot, O-W-T-H. Usually that's how it's spelled in English, ot. And if you look up in a dictionary, it says signal or beacon. And that is really the proper translation, that the sun and the moon, both of them, and the Jewish calendar is based on the sun and the moon, as opposed to the Roman calendar, which was solar, or the Muslim calendar, which is lunar. The Jewish calendar is both solar and lunar. The sun and the moon are a signaling device. So when God wants to bring our attention to something that is important to him, he may sometimes use the sun and the moon as a signaling device, as a beacon. The moon is white, then it becomes red. It's white, becomes red. It catches everyone's attention. It's a signal. And then the word that's translated as seasons is moed. Again, if you look up in the dictionary, what does moed mean? It says it means appointment, fixed time, appointed time. Later on, in the same book, the Torah, the Pentateuch, when it talks about the various feast days, in Leviticus chapter 23, it again uses the word moed. There it's translated as feasts, the same word that's translated as seasons. And seasons is kind of misleading because it makes you think about, the changing of the weather. Like it's winter, it's spring, but we're not talking about seasons. We're talking about appointed days. So the sun and the moon have two purposes here. They are signals, and they're the celestial clock that marks appointed days in which calendar? In the calendar that God then establishes through Moses, saying this is the calendar, this is how it's going to work, and there are 7 appointed days. These are the feasts. You've got, Passover, a very famous feast. If you have any Jewish friends, they might be celebrating Passover. Unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost or Shavuot, the harvest, the Feast of Trumpets, Atonement, Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacle. And it's interesting to note that so far important things in history have occurred on these feast days. When you go back
in conjunction with the blood moon.
Well, I'm going to talk about the events that have happened on the blood moons as well. But this is very interesting because the blood moons and the appointed days are about to coincide in 2014 and 2015. So you have to kind of understand what's the importance of these appointed days and how they have manifested in history. Then you have to understand what's the importance of these signals or blood moons and how they have been important in history. And then when you see them both coinciding, you can look back in history and say, well, when has this happened before? Has anything important happened on the stage of world history when these two things, the signals and the appointed days, coincide? And I'll build that up for your listeners, but you need some background information to really appreciate what's ahead of us.
All right. Let's get into that.
So you've got the feast days, these appointed days on God's calendar. The Feast of Passover. Well, it's we all know that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. The Christ and his disciples are celebrating the Passover meal, and then Jesus is arrested, trialed, and executed, and they really want him dead before the festivities begin, because Passover is a happy occasion. And from then on, the Bible teaches that, in fact, this ritual of the Passover, where a lamb was sacrificed and the blood put on the door, and many other details about it that would be too long for us to get into, were marking in ritual format some event of great spiritual significance for the human race. They were marking in God's calendar in ritual format, and that important event, of course, was the sacrifice of the Son of God, which has spiritual significance for the human race. And so that's why that day was appointed in God's calendar. Now, he's then dead in the grave, and during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And again, if you've seen unleavened bread, you understand kind of the metaphor here. And then he's resurrected and rises from the dead on the Feast of First Fruits. Paul, for instance, who's a Jewish rabbi, really gets into this stuff in his letters and talking about how he's the first fruit, risen from the dead. So suddenly, these three feasts, Passover, unleavened, these appointed times on God's calendar come to life and have spiritual significance. The earth is going round and round, but God knows the beginning from the end. And there are seasons and purpose to everything under heaven, we're told. And suddenly, on this particular juncture in history, on these appointed days, this incredible event happens, which changes world history. And now you go to the next feast, the Feast of the Harvest, Shavuot, or as we say in Greek, Pentecost.
Let me just stop you there, Ali. We'll pick up on this the other around the bend here as we continue to talk about the 4 blood moons. Yes, there is a purpose under the sun. I learned that from Roger McGuinn. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
The truth goes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
So let me give you the shorthand here. 4 blood moons means something is about to change. Ali Siadatan is with us, documentary filmmaker, UFOs, Gods, and Angels, and you can view that at thinkagainproductions.com. We're talking about the significance of 4 blood moons, or 4 total lunar eclipses coming down the pipe, and they fall on significant Jewish feast days this year and next year. You were talking about the next important feast day.
Yes, the next important feast day that has something important has happened to it in the past is the Feast of the Harvest, or Pentecost, where 49 days plus 1 after the Feast of Passover, there was another one of these appointed times in God's calendar the Jews were supposed to keep, and that was the Feast of the Harvest, or Shavuot. And the New Testament says that it was on the day of that feast that the Holy Spirit descended in Jerusalem, and people were enlightened and understood, who Jesus was. And so in that sense, the harvest of the faithful began. And essentially Christianity really took off from there and spread to the whole world. So something very important happened again. History and God's plans moved into a new stage. And so these appointed times, these feasts, these that were kept in ritual form in Israel's history, suddenly came to life. In Jesus' time, he was crucified on Passover, resurrected on the Feast of First Fruits. The Holy Spirit descended on the Feast of Pentecost. And so they suddenly, come to life. These are the appointed times, and there are other appointed times. There are 7 of them in total, and we're expecting that something important will happen in the remainder of the feasts. When it comes to the blood moons, the signals. So we said that in the book of Genesis, we are told that the purpose of the sun and the moon is to give signals to humans when God wants their attention. So when has it happened in the past that these eclipses of the moon, where the moon becomes red, as you explained, the shadow of the sun, of the earth falls on the moon, have coincided with these very important appointed feasts in God's calendar? Where in the 20th century it happened twice. Once it happened in the 1967 window, 1968 windows, where something very important happened in that time. There was a 6-day war. Jerusalem, came under Jewish control, and many people saw a great prophetic importance to that. And everything, the entire Middle East's political landscape has been shaped by the 6-day war. Another time where these blood moons coincided with feast days, these 2 feast days that you mentioned, Passover and Tabernacle, was in 1949, 1950, and so people see that, in 1948, the State of Israel was born, and again, something important happened. When you go further back in history and you say, when did it happen before? It didn't happen in the 18th century or the 19th century or the 17th or 16th century. The last time it happened, this exact configuration of blood moons, these signals falling on these appointed days, was in 1492. And it's interesting, Christopher Columbus writes in his diary, in the same month, he writes, in which their majesties, he's talking about Ferdinand and Isabella, issued the edict that all Jews should be driven out of the kingdom and its territories. In the same month, they gave me the order to undertake with sufficient men my expedition of discovery to the Indies, he writes in his diaries. So that's, was the expulsion of the Jews from the realm of Ferdinand and Isabella. And in that year as well, this happened. When you go back to 70 A.D., the destruction of the Jewish temple, you suddenly find again the same configuration.
Let me just stop you there. So when we say the same configuration, we're talking about the appearance of a total lunar eclipse or a blood moon on Passover and Sukkot.
Yes.
70 AD, the destruction of the temple.
Yes.
Blood moons, 1493 and 1494, when the Jews were being expelled from Spain.
Yes.
Blood moons on Passover and Sukkot, a year after the nation of Israel was assembled.
Yes.
Blood moons on Passover and Sukkot in 1967, being linked to the Six-Day War.
That's right.
What are the odds of that? I mean,
what are the odds? Exactly. What are the odds of that? It's incredible. Here's another one that's very interesting. I find it interesting. The Babylonians decide that they're going to destroy the temple that Solomon has built in the 6th century, in the 500s. There's a whole story that leads up to it. They finally come, they destroy the temple, and it's on a day in the Jewish calendar, the 9th of the month of Av. Okay, history moves forward. The Persians conquer the Babylonians. The Jews are allowed to go back. They eventually rebuild a temple, and then the Persians are conquered by the Greeks. The Greeks fall to the Romans. The Romans are the masters of the world. They take over, Israel. And they get into a dispute with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, the religious council that rules Israel. And eventually, in 70 A.D., the Romans decide to destroy the second temple. And it just so happens that destruction also happens on the same day, the 9th of the month of Av. So centuries apart, empires apart. You know how many millions of events have to turn to coincide that the temple that was, built by the command of God was also destroyed on the same day twice? That's very interesting. So there are these days because God knows the end from the beginning. And He has appointed times and seasons under heaven for His purposes to be fulfilled.
I was going to say, I like the odds better in the Lotto Max.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think we're getting the message loud and clear here is that, when there are blood moons coming our way, 4 of them, and they coincide with these Jewish feast days, we are to stand up and take notice.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so I get that we should be on the lookout for some sort of a change, but how do we get from, blood moons on Passover and Sukkot to, the terrible day of the Lord has come?
Well, in the Old Testament book of Joel, there's a prophecy about the second coming, and God says, I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood. And so it's an eclipse of the sun and an eclipse of the moon, the sun darkness and the moon blood. We if you recall also in the story of the Gospels, when Jesus is crucified, there's an eclipse of the sun. And so, it just so happens that in 2014, there's going to be 2 eclipses of the moon coinciding with these 2 of the feasts, appointed times, Passover and the Feast of Tabernacle, or Sukkot in Hebrew. And then there's going to be an eclipse of the sun on the very first day of the religious calendar of that God establishes in the Bible. And then it'll be followed by 2 more eclipses of the moon in 2015 on the same feast days. And this is something that has happened 62 times since the time of Christ, where blood moons and these feast days coincide, and it's in 2,000 years. That's not a lot, and it's happened twice in the 20th century, 1948, 1967, and this is going to now be the first instance of it in the 21st century of our calendar.
But all these events seem to be inextricably linked to the nation of Israel. So, I mean, yes. I guess all eyes should be turned towards Israel. Coincidentally, the Canadian Prime Minister there sort of making history, addressing the Knesset, the first Canadian Prime Minister to do so. So this is all very interesting.
It is very interesting. It is tied to Israel because in the Bible's narrative, God doesn't tell the story of everything. This was going to happen in Australia, this was going to happen in China, this was going to happen in South Africa. he picks Israel as the character that we're following through history. And it says when you see these things happen to this tribe, to this people, to this nation, then know that this is where I am in the unfolding of events according to my plan and design.
Ali Siadatan is with us, talking about the 4 blood moons. Now, before the day of the Lord, we have to go through the tribulation, and we have to go through the heavenly signs. So even if we have these signposts of the 4 blood moons, and let's assume that the second coming is nigh, we've got a ways to go.
Well, things can happen very quickly, especially in the Middle East. We should, as you said, take heed, take notice. There are signals, they're in God's calendar. If you have to first understand that calendar, it's your day timer. If you lose your day timer, you don't know what's in it. But you find your day timer, you go, okay, these days have been marked by God. Oh, wow, there are those signals that He sends, and He's sending them on these days that He values. Therefore, I should pay attention. Now, look at what's happening in the Middle East right now. Iran has just signed a 6-month truce with the West to hash out some sort of a deal. It's for sure going to involve Syria. That's going to be part of the deal. There's a balance of power where the Sunnis are trying to kick the Shias to the east of the Euphrates, kick them out, and take over Syria from Shia rule to Sunni rule, and change the configuration of the balance of power. And if that does happen in the Middle East, then I would say the Arab Spring has finally bore a major fruit. There has been a major shift in the makeup of the Middle East, and perhaps that shift sets it for the next stage, which is kind of what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, and the next stage would have to be the fall of Satan, right?
Yeah, the next stage would have to be the rise of a leader that, signs a treaty with Israel, unites the Middle East against Jerusalem eventually, and is humbled by the second coming of Christ. But the powers of the Middle East right now are still fighting among themselves. They're not ready to unite behind this guy. There has to be some sort of a birth of a new order, or new regional order there, and perhaps these blood moons are marking a cataclysmic shift in the geopolitics of the area that sets it up for this guy to take over. So we'll have to see. It's all speculation, but I like what you said. We should take heed because God is very loving and patient, and He's really going out of His way to send us signals, to give us prophecies, to explain it in 50 different ways, repeat it in His Word, so that compassionately He's reaching out to His people, to the human race, and translated in all these languages and saying, hello, I have never left you in ignorance. I've never left you in darkness. I'm speaking to you. Please pay attention. And I think that's very important to notice. The universe is shifting into alignment in accordance with events of human history. It's just mind-boggling how many things have to click together on the cosmic level, on the human level, for all of these things to match. That at this time in history, what's happening in the Middle East with Israel's return, these blood moons, these feast days, it's definitely, I think, something that we should pay attention to.
Okay, so to recap, the 4 blood moons coming April the 15th, October the 8th of 2014, and then next year, April the 4th and September the 28th, 2015. But again, the added significance here is that the total solar eclipses, there will be a total solar eclipse on March the 20th of 2015, which is the biblical calendar of Nisan 1.
That's right, the first day, Rosh Hashanah. The first day of the biblical calendar will have an eclipse of the sun, and then the feasts that follow, the Passover and Sukkot, will have eclipses of the moon. That's 2015, and then there'll be 2 eclipses of the moon in 2014. And you want to know the last one, the eclipse of the moon? The moon becomes red on 2015. The very last one happens on the full moon when the moon is closest in its orbit to the Earth. So it's going to appear huge. And you can't see these things from all over the planet. That particular one you will be able to see from the city of Jerusalem. So if you're standing on the Temple Mount or by the wall, looking up into the sky in the Feast of Sukkot in 2015, you will see a gigantic full moon close in its orbit to the Earth, a supermoon, that will be completely red, that you can see from Jerusalem. And remember, the Feast of Sukkot or Tabernacles, when the Jews all over Israel built little tents, and they go outside and they sleep in those tents with the ceiling, the roof uncovered, looking into the sky. They're going to be fulfilling that appointed time in their tents, looking up into the sky, and lo and behold, they're going to see a gigantic red moon in 2015 on the Feast of Sukkot from their little booths. And, I'm sure it's going to speak into the hearts of many of them because they're more familiar with this calendar and the important days and things that have happened in their history and these signs and signals. Christians are catching up because we shifted calendars, right? We follow the Gregorian calendar, where none of these appointed times appear on it. So,
do you think that was a conspiracy to confuse us?
Yes,
to switch to the Gregorian calendar?
For sure. The conspiracy is always, in this case, going back to Satan himself. It's like, okay, you know what? God makes a day timer for us, puts his important days on it, and we see that things happen in Christ's life that were important, and the Holy Spirit coming. But then Satan says, like, you know what? Give me your calendar. I'll just, shove it in the corner, and we'll forget about it, and I'll give you a brand new calendar. It has none of the stuff written on it, but hey, you're happy, aren't you? You got a calendar. So I think, yes.
That's right. My month is clear. My month has been cleared. I'm good to do lunch this month.
Right.
So, Ali, where are you going to be April 15th and October the 8th of this year? Are you going to be outside looking at the blood moon and
yes,
contemplating?
I am going to be outside contemplating and praying and opening my ears to anything the Lord may have to say. And it's I find myself suddenly drawn into this conversation. It's something I passively followed. If anyone wants, detailed information, I recommend some of the two authors you mentioned, Hagee and Blitz. El Shaddai Ministries is his ministry. He's really the guy who cracked it and has incredible research on it, and you can read more about it.
And give a quick plug for you. You do some spiritual studies yourself.
Yes, in downtown Toronto, I have a center here where we teach healing arts, martial arts, and spiritual studies. You can find us on the internet. It's WUXING, Wuxing, martialarts.com. And you can watch my documentary at thinkagainproductions.com, where we make a connection between the UFOs, angels, gods, and prophetic events, and it's also kind of food for thought.
You're always a food for thought, Ali. I appreciate your time. Ali Siadatan. Thank you, my friend.
You have Richard Syrett's Strange Planet, following the truth wherever it leads, exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites, revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard.
Coming to you live from the Elite City Resort in Kalamata, Greece, actually. Our final broadcast from Kalamata. We went up to Athens and then eventually head home to Toronto. We're going to talk about BEKs here in just a moment. Are you familiar with BEKs? Yet another acronym, and this one from the field of the paranormal. Black-eyed kids or black-eyed children. These are cases that involve sorts of children who approach individuals and ask them for random favors or help, and these kids are reported to look normal in appearance except for their solid black eyes. Just solid black eyes. And the mannerisms that these children show upon encounter are not like you would observe in children in that particular age group. Usually witnesses say these children appear to be in a trance-like state. They can be described as lethargic, catatonic, yet forceful, even demanding and insistent in getting you to do what they want. But again, it's these black eyes that are so disconcerting. Rosemary Ellen Guiley is standing by, our paranormal expert who joins us the second Sunday of every month. We'll be here to chat about that. Just a quick programming note. At the bottom of the hour, we're going to throw the phone lines wide open. The last half hour of the program, you, me, and the telephone. give me a call and ask me anything or talk about anything, as long, of course, as it has to do with things conspiratorial, paranormal, supernatural. You know the drill. You've been listening to the program for long enough now. That being said, Rosemary Ellen Guiley is a leading expert on the paranormal. She's the author of 45-plus books and hundreds of articles on a wide range of topics. She conducts original field investigations of haunted and mysterious sites and researches entity contact experiences and spirit communications. She is a consulting editor of Fate magazine.
Rosemary Ellen Guiley, how are you?
Doing well, Richard.
I have to tell you, I received an email recently, since the last time you were on, from a woman, and she asked me whether I had ever done a show on something called black-eyed people, or specifically black-eyed children. And I said, not that I could recall. However, that jogged my memory, and I remembered receiving an email from a woman, and I actually went back in my files and I found it. And it was a woman in the States who was in at that time they had Kmart. I don't know if the Kmart is still around, but she was in a Kmart parking lot, and she was suddenly surrounded by a group of small children, like maybe a half dozen children. And many of them were sort of, dressed in hoodies or hooded sweatshirts, and they all sort of were looking down at their feet, kind of shy. But one of them sort of assumed the role of spokesperson and was rather precocious, very eloquent for, let's say, a 10 or an 11-year-old, almost speaking like an adult. And they seemed to be asking this woman if they could get a ride somewhere. And, of course, there were half dozen of them. There was no way she could fit them all into her car. But then, as she looked into this child's face, she was horrified, because this child had black eyes. I'm not just talking about black pupils, but solid black, no whites in the eyes, just solid black. And then she noticed the skin color was somewhat sort of white and bluish, which again was, very unsettling. And when the child noticed that the woman obviously noticed the features, the child became very angry, very animated, very aggressive, and started ordering this woman around, saying, "You are going to let us in your car, and you're going to drive us here." And she almost felt like she was under some sort of mind control. Somehow she managed to break out of the spell. She got in her car, locked the doors, and tore off. And she wrote me this email. So, Rosemary Ellen Guiley, what can you tell us about black-eyed people or black-eyed children? What's going on here?
They're one of the newest wrinkles in a very old and ancient phenomenon. And they've been documented since about the 1980s. At first they were called the black-eyed kids, and then it became the black-eyed children. Now, really, we need to call them black-eyed people, because accounts are coming in about black-eyed adults as well, acting in the same manner as the woman described in her encounter. I consider them to be a mutation of phenomena that have plagued human beings from the beginning of time. And it's taken different forms throughout history, as fairies, as the devil, as men in black, as shadow people. I believe myself that the black-eyed children and adults are a form taken by the jinn. And I did write about them in the Jinn Connection, my new book. Some people think that they're demons and they act in demonic ways. But it seems that whatever it is, if it's the jinn or some other sort of personification of malevolence, whatever it is, it morphs and shapeshifts throughout history to appear in ways that are very consistent in terms of how it attacks and upsets people. But whether it's a mysterious creature or a devil-looking thing or black-eyed children, it all points back to the same origin. And I do believe the jinn are involved in this.
That's interesting. You and I have talked extensively about jinn, these interdimensional entities that I guess predate humankind and are somewhat resentful that we were sort of squeezing them out of their turf. The interesting thing I found is with these black-eyed children, because I went on and did online and did a little research as well, and that is the fact that they seem to require people's permission rather than just, barging into someone's house. They'll appear on the doorstep. They'll knock. They'll first ask politely, "Can we come in? Can we come in?" But if you don't invite them into your home, or as this woman who emailed me, if you don't allow them to come into your car, they can't. And to me, that's sort of reminiscent of something that we talked about last month, which is at least the Hollywood depiction of the vampire. You have to invite them in. What's going on there?
Well, actually, that sort of premise exists with all kinds of negative entity encounters. It's very prominent in the vampire lore, of course. We also find it in encounters with demons, that demons, in order for them to wreak the most havoc, we have to somehow invite them into our lives. Now, when they approach people, it's often when people are very distracted. There are a lot of parking lot encounters. People are putting things in their car, getting out of their car, getting into their car, and all of a sudden there are these kids, and it's seldom one. It's usually two or more, but not like a huge group of them. And so the average person is just like, oh, there's some kids here and maybe they need some help. So a lot of times they look disheveled, kind of ragged. And they don't really notice right off the bat that something is very wrong with these children. It's making the eye contact that brings the problems. And when they lock eyes with these entities, they see that they are totally black. And they're often filled with terror and dread. Meanwhile, these entities, these children are insisting that they want something. They want to get into the car. Sometimes they'll come and bang on store doors after they've closed. They want in because they want something. They come to the doors of residences. And sometimes they do want to go somewhere. They want something from you. But what they want is that link to you, and they get it through the eye contact. And once that's made, it seems like they have a hook into a person. The person will often feel very wasted. They might have health problems. They might have nightmares for weeks on end where these black-eyed beings invade their dreams. So these characteristics are shared by other kinds of invasive entities. It's just a different form for something that really wants to harm us.
Is it possible, let me just play skeptic here for a moment, and when we're talking about the appearance of the eye and the fact that there is no differentiation between the pupil and what is normally the white part of the human eye, which I believe is called the sclera or the sclera. So in other words, there is no white part. It's just all black. Now, in certain animals, you'll have the pupil, and then you'll have maybe the sclera will be, like in a dog or a horse, for example, the sclera will be maybe a light brown. So there's a differentiation. Mm-hmm. But with these black-eyed children, I mean, the pupil, the retina, the iris, it's all, the sclera, it's all black. Is it possible that there's some sort of an eye disease, I don't know, a vitamin deficiency that might explain this?
I don't know of any, and this is such a common characteristic. These cases are scattered all over the place where, people like myself and David Weatherly, who investigated this phenomenon, a researcher that I know in Arizona and wrote a book on the subject, a lot of us are getting reports from all over the world. And so I don't know of any eye disease. I think it is more a supernatural phenomenon. Now, the question is, if these are entities who are trying to get a hook into us and gain something from us, why would they give themselves away with black eyes? And we run into these contradictions in the paranormal all the time. And for example, with shadow people. Black-eyed children could be very related to shadow people, which are a form of jinn. And these are dark entities who come into the bedroom. They look like silhouettes, usually tall men, and they always seem to be dressed in like a trench coat or a cape, and they're often wearing a hat. Why would they need to wear a hat? And sometimes the hat is kind of silly looking, but the figures strike terror into the heart of people, and it may very well be, I've speculated with the shadow people, that maybe they're wearing a hat because the entity that's shape-shifting into that form can't get the head right, and so they cover something with the hat. And it may very well be with the black-eyed children that they can't alter the eyes, or they deliberately have the black eyes because they know that's going to absolutely strike terror. And when we have that automatic fear reaction, there's an adrenaline rush, and in a millisecond, we could be like very open to them to grab hold of us in some sort of energetic way. Now, we find the same phenomenon with the abducting ETs. The abductees are mesmerized by compelling eyes. The jinn, when they want to put someone under their spell, or they want to seduce someone, or they want to get something from someone, they also have mesmerizing eyes. So it's a shared phenomenon with predatory entities.
All right, let's take a time out. We'll come back and continue to talk about the phenomenon known as black-eyed children. Actually, there are black-eyed adults, and we'll touch on that when we come back as well. Rosemary Ellen Guiley, right here on The Conspiracy Show, coming to you live from Kalamata in southern Greece. Stay with us.
The truth goes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Rosemary Ellen Guiley joins us the second Sunday of every month. And tonight we're talking about black-eyed children. I've received some emails about this phenomenon, people being approached by children, or let's say adolescents, and being totally shocked and horrified when they discover that these children have solid black eyes. No whites in the eyes at all, just solid black. And Rosemary Ellen Guiley is suggesting that there may be a connection between these black-eyed children and an entity that she has documented quite a bit, known as the jinn, which are, of course, known as genies here in the Western culture. There are, though, cases of adults. People have seen adults with black eyes, and I've heard black-eyed adults mentioned in connection with the notorious men in black, those people that will show up after someone has, seen a UFO and perhaps thought about going public with it. What can you tell us about these encounters with adults with black eyes?
Well, they're very similar to the child encounters, where they want something. They want something from you. And the cases with the men in black, they started out being documented in the UFO literature, where people who had marked experiences, sightings, or contact suddenly had these entities in their life. They were visited by these weird-looking men with dark eyes, black clothing, and strange behavior, who seemed to know a lot about them and warned them not to talk about it. All of these things are interconnected in very strange ways, because the men in black have connections to the shadow people, who have connections to jinn, and the jinn have connections to abducting ETs, and the ETs and the jinn have connections to fairies, and fairies have connections to the devil. So are we dealing with like an Oz behind the curtain here? And who is that Oz? Many people think that it's probably the jinn. Other people say it's demons. John Keel called it the trickster of the universe, who some cosmic force which is always messing around with us at our expense, and we never seem to know why. So the adult encounters can be equally terrifying as the child encounters. Now, one thing also that seems to harm people the most is touch. And if you lock eyes with these entities, you're in for a hard ride. And if one of them is able to touch you in any way, it seems to impart something into your well-being and your health and your mind that also has a very deteriorating effect. But the black-eyed adults they don't seem to be as common yet as the children, and maybe that's just because we just haven't got enough reports of them in yet.
But if one goes online, this is a very popular topic, and there are, I dare say, thousands of these accounts just online. And I mean, I don't know what the motivation would be for someone to lie about this. I mean, they don't leave their contact information. It's not like they're looking for fame or fortune. What do you think? Is this phenomena real, Rosemary?
I treat it as real, and I have talked to more skeptical people who say, look, we never heard about the black-eyed kids until around the 80s, and then someone must have just started this up as an urban legend. Now everybody's jumping in. There are too many connections with these beings to other kinds of predatory entities that we've been dealing with throughout human history. And I consider it to be a shape-shifted form of yet another way for predatory entities to bother us. And it seems like once we get accustomed to one form, the entity or the phenomena, if it's not personalized, it morphs into something else. And I think that's what we've got here. I suspect that there are many more cases than we know about right now, despite the fact that so many have been posted on the Internet. When I started researching shadow people about 10 years ago, there were things posted on the Internet, some cases, and I started researching and publicizing shadow people a lot. And this phenomenon also grew, and now you can find thousands of cases of shadow people. I think that people suddenly, they read these cases and they suddenly realize, oh my gosh, this is real. It's happened to me or it's happened to somebody I know. It was not my imagination.
Have you had an encounter with a black-eyed person, or has one of your, someone that you know, or maybe a client, someone that you've done an investigation for, have they had an encounter with a black-eyed child?
I have not yet encountered black-eyed children myself, and I don't have any in my active cases, or even some of my recent cases that are now closed. I have received emails from people who have heard about the black-eyed children, or they've read about the jinn, and they make the connection to the jinn, and they want to tell me about them. So I am indeed getting reports about them. And people are, when they have these encounters, they are genuinely shook up. I don't think people make these things up. All of us deal in the paranormal, we all deal with cases that are more projections or, fantasies or stimulated by having seen something on TV. And, that's a hazard in the business. But on the other hand, people carry these secrets around for a long time sometimes before they feel comfortable with talking about them, because they do fear ridicule. And I think that's probably one of the factors here, that people have had these encounters and they either don't know what to make of them, or they've shrugged it off as, well, maybe I just imagined they had black eyes or something, and then they read something that matches their experience, and suddenly they can't ignore it any longer.
Well, witness to that is the fact that we're talking about it now over the radio, and people hearing this may feel that it's time to unburden themselves. Just received this email. My husband and I were on our way up north on I-75, which travels from Detroit, Michigan, all the way down into Florida. But this email is from Michigan. traveling way up north on I-75 during the afternoon. Luckily, it was not at our normal time in the evening. We have a little place in northern lower Michigan and often go up there for the weekends. As was our custom, we pulled in at our usual rest stop, and I went into the woman's restroom. As I was preparing to leave the room, I suddenly noticed a thin, dark-haired woman standing alone and staring directly at me. I instantly felt a terrible sense of dread, as though there was something deeply unnatural about her. I then noticed the eyes, which had been staring coldly at me, and they were completely black. I saw no color whatsoever and no pupils. I felt an extremely strong need to get away from her as quickly as possible, as there was something quite threatening about her, or quietly threatening about her. Her stare was devoid of any emotion other than something very cold and disconnected. You know, as I'm reading this email, Rosemary, and it goes on for quite a while, but it almost sounds like the accounts I hear from alien abductees talking about grays. And they, of course, have black eyes, solid black eyes, and people describe them as being cold and disconnected. Do you think, I mean, I know you tend to believe that they could be related to the jinn, but could they be ETs?
They certainly could. And in fact, we really don't know how many entities are out there interacting with us, because a great deal of shape-shifting seems to go on. The jinn, for example, are known as masterful shape-shifters. We have many kinds of alien entities involved in the abduction scenario. And we have cases where people have witnessed being shape-shift from one form to another. And they seem to do it right in front of them. We have cases of the reptilian kind among those where people think they're dealing with a human, and then suddenly they see reptilian characteristics come out, literally scaly skin and the reptilian eyes. And sometimes it's just for an instant, but it's an unmistakable sort of transformation. The universal reaction that people have to all of these forms is this dread. And I have come to the conclusion that this is part of a stalking of human beings where that is the desired reaction. They want the dread because it weakens us. We lose a lot of life force energy when we're frightened. And it's probably something that they literally use as a food source. There are many entities besides the jinn who are known as feeders, and non-human vampires are among those, where the life force is literally vampirized off. So there's even the possible scenario that whoever or whatever is behind these manifestations is trying something out on us to see, you know, how well will this stick as a tactic against human beings.
Well, this email writer goes on to say, there was also something almost predatory about her, as though she was honing in on prey while she stood there so still. I had a strange sense of her feeling superior or stronger in some way. Again, the sense of a predator watching its prey. I left as quickly as possible, showing as little reaction to her as possible. I got back into the car and left. I have to say this was one of the most memorable brief experiences I've ever had around a person, especially a stranger. I have never been able to shake the unexplainable feeling that she wasn't human.
They aren't. They look like humans, and they take that form, but there's really nothing human about them. I am very convinced of that.
What do you think What do you think they would do, Rosemary? I mean, if someone were to allow them into their car or into their home, what do you think would happen?
We might have a missing person case on our hands.
Well, listen, Rosemary, thanks for bringing this to our attention. Black-eyed children, again, a relatively new phenomena, only around for the last 25, maybe 30 years, and we're hearing about it. And if you go online, you'll learn that this seems to be a growing, expanding experience. People are writing about it more and more often. Thank you for this, Rosemary. What's up next for you?
I'm going to be speaking on after-death communications and dreams at the end of this month, August, at the International Association for Near-Death Studies in Arlington, Virginia. And in fact, that's the subject of a new book that I've just put together that will be out in time for the conference, called Dreams from the Afterlife, Messages from the Dead, Visions of the Past and Future. So that's been my current project. Also still at work on my book on multidimensional portals, which will be out when I probably see you next in Arizona for the UFO Congress.
Ah, yes, next February. All right, Rosemary, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, and have a great time.
Rosemary Ellen Guiley, the website again, www.visionaryliving.com.
And we'll come back in just a few moments. Open lines now till the top of the hour as we broadcast live from the Elite City Resort Hotel in Kalamata, Greece. The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Serrett.
As you're staring up at the night sky, ever wonder who's staring back? You're listening to Richard Serrett's Strange Planet.
Well, yes, this is the Conspiracy Show, but it is Richard Serrettless. Richard is at home under the weather, and my name is Victor Vigiani, sitting in for Richard this evening on the Conspiracy Show. Glad to have you with us, and we've got some interesting things to chat about this evening. But first, I got to get something off my chest. This morning, I was listening to the radio, not this station, by the way, just another relatively high-profile radio station. And the moderator was talking to a scientist. They were talking about aerosol spraying. And apparently, I haven't read the book, I can't really say too much about it, but the whole tenor of the interview was the scientist explaining aerosol spraying. And his angle on it was that governments and science should begin to look into aerosol spraying so that we can recover our atmosphere, take the pollutants out and stop things like climate change or whatever you want to call it, and the acidification of the oceans and lakes, and throwing around the ideas of considering having airplanes go up into the air and spraying sulfur and other kinds of compounds in the air to get rid of all of the pollutants. And I could hardly hold back from screaming and yelling at the radio. And the very idea, and for those people who listen to this program on a regular basis, you will well know that this kind of stuff, this spraying in the atmosphere, has been going on for at least 15 years, if not longer. There are jets in our airspace flying over virtually every part of North America, and I was in Prague 2 summers ago and saw it there too on a clear day. The chemtrails, oh, wait a minute, I should correct myself, geoengineering attempts, I call them chemtrails, have been going on for a long time. They're there. I was in Washington last May to attend the citizen hearings on disclosure by our friend Stephen Bassett, and every single morning from 7:30 to 8:30 I would make my way down to the Washington Press Club for the day's hearings and see in the skies over Washington, D.C., all of these chemtrails. Where has this scientist been? I can't believe it. He's actually suggesting that we consider this. It's been going on for decades. And why this fellow doesn't know about this, and why the radio station that this was broadcast on isn't aware of it, somebody on the research team needs to get out of fantasy land. It really disturbed me, and I know that most of you who know a lot about the chemtrail or geoengineering issue would be suitably upset like myself. So I've got that off my chest, and I think I feel a whole lot better about it. We've got a tremendous hour of dialogue with you this evening. Our guest this evening, actually, you know what? Before I do that, what I should do is talk about next week. Yeah, let me do that first. Next week, Richard and I will be on the program, and we will be talking to Tim Ball about the UN Agenda 21. I'll leave that hanging for you because Tim is an expert on Agenda 21, what it means, why it was brought about, and we'll be talking to him next week. And also, we will be speaking to Gary Hasseltine, who is a UFO researcher, former United Kingdom police officer turned UFO investigator, who has he did testify at the citizen hearings back in May and gave some excellent testimony. And he's a no-nonsense kind of fellow, and I think you're really going to want to listen to that individual next week along with Richard and I. And also, one of our regular guests, Nelson Thal, returns with another edition of State Psychops. So we need to pay attention to that. Put that on your calendar for next week. Our guest this evening, we're talking about the lost Malaysian jet and all of the controversy around that. And you know as well as I do that just about every radio station, television station in North America and throughout the world has been throwing out ideas about what happened to the Malaysian jet, the Boeing 777. And this evening's guest, Daniel Kaiser, he's a pilot, an explorer, research scientist, and veteran. He is a recipient of the Presidential Unit Citation presented by then President Jimmy Carter. Mr. Kaiser has worked on an OSI special ops and counterintelligence operative from 1974 to 1979, including tours of duty throughout the Asian Pacific Theater of Operations. And he's got a tremendous background in all of this information, and he's going to share with us probably one of the most difficult to swallow, understand, consider. It is a completely divergent line of thinking, and I know I've read some of the notes prior to the program about it, and Daniel is very, very concerned about what happened to this jet and what it might mean. So let's welcome Daniel Kaiser to the Conspiracy Show. Hello, Daniel. How are you?
How are you doing, Victor? I'm sorry to hear that Richard's under the weather.
Yeah, he's been fighting it all week, Daniel. And he's usually a pretty healthy guy.
Maybe somebody doesn't want him to talk.
That's part of it too. Well, it's just great to have you on the program because I, as many people in North America, you can't turn on your television or radio without hearing about this story. And it has literally captivated millions throughout the planet for the last, 2 or 3 weeks, easily 3 weeks, I think 22 days. Isn't that about right?
Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's something that has really risen to the surface and encompassed and literally taken over, I guess, the media. And before we get into the theory that you're espousing, and when I read some of the notes that Richard gave me in preparation for the show, I literally I was just stunned. It really frightened me. It absolutely frightened me. And talking to some of the friends that I have who do listen to the show quite often, just throwing out a few ideas, it's something that did not occur to them. So before we get into actually the chronology of your theory, let's talk about the chronology of what happened as far as you know about this jet taking off, getting into the air, and then disappearing. Can you just sort of outline the chronology that you know occurred?
Well, I don't have all the specifics here right here in front of me with all the times and the turns and the altitudes and all of that. Yeah. But I can say is that what I would like to do is to cut through the propaganda, the mainstream media news, and get right down to what the facts are. And the facts are is that we had a Flight 370, which is a Boeing 777, take off, heading towards China on a scheduled passenger flight, and all of a sudden it turned directions and headed out over or towards the Indian Ocean and shut off their transponder equipment, which is common with a hijacking situation, turned off its beacon locators, and basically went dark. It flew to an altitude of over 45,000 feet, and then systematically and sporadically, according to the facts, the plane came down in a very high-speed dive down to 5,000 feet, leveled out, and basically disappeared.
Now, when you say turned off the transponder and the location beacons, could you just, for the benefit of our audience, just tell us what a transponder is and the other location beacons are?
Well, basically with the aircraft, transponders and location beacons are used for being able to identify the aircraft for air traffic controller. It shows the air traffic controllers where the aircraft is, what kind of aircraft it is. It shows an ID, which the word is squawks. It squawks or talks or continually beeps this information saying, hey, I'm Flight 307 or 370. I'm Boeing 777, and I'm at this altitude, and I'm at this airspeed, and I'm heading in this direction.
I see. So it gives everybody in the ATC, the air traffic controllers, information about what the plane is, what flight it is, where it's heading, and they keep on. I guess if it's flying over ground, they're handed off to different locations. Is that correct? As the plane moves through the air. Yeah.
depending on the radar and what airspace that you're in, it can be handed off several times to anywhere from military bases, operations to civilian airlines or civilian air traffic control centers, that type of thing.
When the plane took off, who was flying it, as far as you know?
Well, when it took off, it was the two crew members. It was the captain and the co-pilot, both of them Malaysian and both of them Muslim.
I see. At any time, do you think that changed, or would they have been the ones that perhaps accomplished these other maneuvers?
I can't speculate. It'd be pure speculation because the facts I can't. When I'm talking to you tonight, I'm going to give you what the facts are.
Okay.
Then I will give you how these facts add up and what I consider to be, and my team considers to be, a logical and predictable outcome. That doesn't mean that we're right on the money. That doesn't mean this is absolutely going to happen. But if you base it all on the facts, I think you're going to find out that this scenario that we're giving you here is absolutely plausible.
Yeah, I guess
more than likely is
for sure.
The truth.
When I do the research that I do, we call what you just explained converging lines of evidence. They may be individual factoids, but most of these factoids point in a certain direction, and if you get enough factoids pointing in a certain direction, those converging lines of evidence lead to only one conclusion. I guess that's what you're leading towards. Tell us about when you use the word team. What did that mean? You said you and your team. Tell us about that.
Well, I've got connections with other engineers, other scientists, other researchers throughout the world that I talk to on a daily basis. We share information back and forth with each other. Things, for example, like we did some work on Kosovo during the Balkans. We've done work on some of the stuff that's going on in Israel. We've done work on different disappearances and kidnappings, things like that.
Okay, well, that's we're going to have to hold on there for a second because we have to take a break, Daniel. And when we come back on the other side, we'll get more into this absolutely stunning theory that we're going to hear about. My name is Victor Vigiani, and this is The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
The truth goes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
And you just might need those numbers tonight, ladies and gentlemen, because after we hear what our guest Daniel Kaiser has to say about the loss of the Malaysian jet, Boeing 777, you just may want to, send in your 2 cents. In any case, Daniel, you mentioned off the top there that the aircraft went into a very steep dive at around 45,000 feet. First of all, how steep was the dive? And then 3 questions, actually. How steep was the dive? How far down did it go? And why did it go into such a steep dive?
Well, there's 2. You're bringing up something I was going to bring up with you a little later in the show, but I'll go ahead and do it now.
Sure.
The 777, that particular aircraft has an automated landing system on it because the 777 is a fly-by-wire. So if you have the autopilot on, and if both the pilots and the entire crew and everybody in the plane all suffocated because, let's say, a massive decompression, that plane, if it was on autopilot, will fly itself to its destination and physically land itself by itself.
My goodness.
Okay, that's how sophisticated this particular 777 is. It has an operational range of between 5,000 and 9,300 nautical miles. Fully loaded, it can fly 5,000 nautical miles easily. That's full fuel, full cargo, everything. If it was stripped down, this 77, and it just had a light cargo and full fuel, it has a range. This comes from Boeing. This is not for me. It has a range of over 11,000, almost 12,000 miles. That's basically that plane can go anywhere in the world. Boeing's maximum payload on that aircraft is 104 tons, and it has a cruising altitude of over 43,000 feet. So what you asked me is that the aircraft went up to 43,000, 45,000 feet, and all of a sudden, after a short period of time, in turn, did a steep dive and then leveled out. We figure that the only reason why the aircraft would go to such a high altitude would be to depressurize the cabin and to get rid of or suffocate all the passengers.
I see.
The steep dive then would be where the pilots were trying to get down below, because the pilots have more oxygen. They have about 45 minutes worth of oxygen aboard, and emergency oxygen. The passengers have between 12 and 15 minutes, depending on the number of people, that type of thing. So if you've gotten rid of the passengers and possibly the flight crew, who knows, and you in turn take this steep dive and you level out below 10,000 feet so you can have now get off oxygen. One of the things that we found that was a key indicator here is that the facts show that the Boeing 777, or Flight 370, did not do a straight dive into the ground. It did not dive straight down. It can't do that because of the way the electronics are and the computer systems on the 777 are. It will not allow the aircraft, as a safety measure, will not allow the aircraft to go beyond its structural limitations as far as overspeed.
Even with pilot input?
Correct. Even with pilot input, you cannot physically do it. It's impossible. So what would happen is, even if you took the stick and smashed it all the way forward, straight towards the ground, threw the engines on full, when that reached its maximum speed, safety speed, pre-programmed into their flight systems, the aircraft would automatically cut back the engines, make a bank to the right, make a bank to the left, begin to pull the nose up, whatever it would do. But it would bring it back, automatically bring it back to a safe or relatively safe or to its maximum airspeed that it can take. That would account for what they called was a real, as they reported, it was a very strange type of, it would turn left in its dive, then it would turn right in its dive, then it would go up and slow down, then it would speed up. That's because the computer systems, according to our research, that would be because the computer systems were keeping the aircraft from overspeeding and breaking up in the air.
I see. So just let me interrupt you there. So when the transponders and the beacon locators were turned off, did any ATC, air traffic controller or whoever, did they pick up the fact that the transponders were turned off, either manually or otherwise? Did they pick up the fact that this thing went into the steep dive, or is this something that you're sort of putting forward now?
No, the ATCs. Part of this was found out later by the Boeing people themselves and the manufacturers of the engines. The engines have, unbeknownst to most pilots, the engines are set up to where they have a pinging system that is able to communicate with satellites to tell how to go back to the manufacturer to tell the manufacturer how the engines are operating.
I see. Okay.
And there's no way to control that. You cannot disconnect that from the cabin.
I see. So now why aren't we hearing this on the regular media newscasts?
You're asking me to speculate. I think that mainstream media is, I think they're being manipulated by whoever, whatever, with this information. I think we've been sent on a wild goose chase. Our indications are when that aircraft turned and headed back for the Indian Ocean with no pinger, with no ID on, no way to per se track it in real time, that when it went to the 45,000 feet, the pilots dropped it down as fast as they could down to less than 5,000 feet. And by the way, that only took a couple of minutes to get down there, so they were really in a steep dive. Some of the calculations say close to 700 miles an hour the aircraft was diving.
My goodness.
Pull up, slow down, and then back down again. The speed would come back up.
Do we know how loaded the craft was? Was it filled to capacity? Do you know any idea?
Well, they had a full load of fuel, and from what I've been told, from what I've read, they had a full load of fuel and about 200 or 230 passengers on board, I believe, or something in that neighborhood.
Right.
The fuel capabilities of that aircraft that were on there would give it a range, depending on their speed and weather conditions, things like this, would give it a range of well over 6,000 nautical miles.
I see. Okay, now we have to take this in a completely different direction. We've gone over some of the information to give our listeners a foundation of what might have happened up in the air. Now I'd like you to throw at us the theory of why this happened, how it was commandeered, and what you might think, you can handle this any way you want, might be the reasoning behind the disappearance of this jet. What's your first comment on that?
Well, with the team and I basically come up with two theories for this aircraft. Both of them are not good. Both of them consider that the aircraft has been hijacked to be used as a weapons platform. Now, we feel that the mainstream media and a lot of the governments, for some reason, are not being told the truth, and they're never going to find, you're not going to find any wreckage of this aircraft. I really believe it. That's why there hasn't been any bodies floating, and I think that they're sending people all around until everybody gets tired of listening to it, and everybody will sit back and say the aircraft had just crashed and that's it. That gets these terrorists off the hook. The two things that we believe is, first one is that we can use this aircraft as a weapons platform because of its long range. We could put a small nuclear device, something like Korea has, which is supposed to be 500 kilotons, in the 500 kiloton range, or something maybe Iran has put together that might be smaller or might be a little bit larger. Be put aboard this aircraft and sent over or sent out to any city, including Israel or, let's say, mainland USA, for example. This aircraft could fly over the North Pole, come down through Canada, and detonate above the United States. And basically, with that explosion at altitude, could take out the power grids of Canada, the United States, and parts of Mexico. Turn us back to the horse and buggy days.
What an incredible scenario. So you're saying that if this was the kind of hijacking that you're alluding to, that this craft somehow went into its dive, did what it did, went down below 10,000 feet, and somehow eluded radar or did whatever you can do at that flight level, and then somehow landed somewhere to be hidden, commandeered, and covered up somehow, and then potentially to be used as a weapon of mass destruction at some point in the future. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, Victor, let me try this. We've plotted out that from the information that we have, there's a place called Maldives, which is just north of Diego Garcia, which is a U.S. military installation. Big, huge nuclear bomber base. Do you think that the U.S. nuclear bomber base would have probably the latest and greatest radar to make sure that nothing got close to them? You would assume.
Of course, yes, of course.
Okay. Yeah. One of my sources that has a connection with the people at Diego said that their radar, quote unquote, was down for maintenance during the time that this so-called the Flight 370 basically had been reported to fly over the northern island of Maldives. From that trajectory, it's a clear and easy shot. It's basically about 3,600 nautical miles from the turnaround point back in Asia for them to land in Somalia. Now, why we chose Somalia was this. Somalia has no formal government. None. There's no law, no international law per se there. Mm-hmm. Second off is that the southern part of that nation is completely under control by the radical Muslim group, Al-Qaeda funded, that type of thing. In doing so, there are, just in a short amount of period of time, we had located over 10 runways that were abandoned runways that were over 7,000 feet. Some of them as long as 10,000 feet that could easily handle landing this aircraft in.
Okay.
From Somalia, who knows where it went? It could be parked there. There's hangars. If you do the research, if you do look on Google, you do Google Earth, you can actually come in and start looking for some of these abandoned runways or military installations in Somalia. You'll find that there's a lot that's there. Now, mainstream news told us there was no place this plane could land. There was no place a runway was big enough to handle it or take care of it.
Which is rubbish. Which is rubbish, basically.
The facts are not there. I mean, the facts are is that there's plenty of places
of course,
in a lawless land where there is no military, there is no real radar to check it. This aircraft, according to the people in Maldives, there were over 100 farmers and citizens in Maldives that said this plane came over at palm tree level. It was so loud that it shook the people's houses. But nobody wants to talk about that part.
Right. And there, you're talking about a plane is capable of flying around 50 to 100 feet off the deck, off the ground, at over 600 miles an hour.
Absolutely, sir. You're absolutely correct. So with the fuel aboard, the time that was allotted, what could have happened before anybody had really, mainstream media had picked up anything, this thing is sitting somewhere, or was sitting somewhere, either getting refueled or hidden, camouflage from the satellites, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
My big thing here is this, Victor, and I'm going to step way out on a branch here, and I'm going to probably get my butt knocked off.
That's quite all right. I'm used to being out on a limb with good friends. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to say the U.S. military, I do not believe for 1 second that Diego Garcia radar was down. I'm ex-military. We do not take down the main radar and leave yourself completely blind. It just doesn't happen. You do the backup, you have a secondary, you use shift, whatever, but you do not make yourself blind, especially with a B-52 bomber base. So they knew, the people, the U.S. military had to know, absolutely in my mind, my heart of hearts, had to know this aircraft was in their airspace.
No doubt about it.
They either let it go by or the U.S. military shot it down. Now, I would be thankful to heavens to find out that it was shot down before it could be used in one of the two scenarios that we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that would make me real happy, especially for the millions of people that this weapons platform could deliver the death and destruction to. But I don't feel that that's happened. I believe that it's been allowed to go wherever it was going. I know that with this corridor and with the traffic that's there, with the military units that are there are gaps or holes at low altitude that a plane could weave through that make its way to Somalia without much radar detection. And in doing so, you would have to have somebody on the inside giving you that flight plan.
Of course, yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I'm just going to get into a break here in a second, but Daniel, you know what? I think you're describing, I'm sitting here in my chair just literally shivering, you're describing almost another 9/11 scenario here. A Hollywood script couldn't be written any better than this. And when you hear about the number of jets that the U.S. Air Force took out of the air on September 11th, this kind of is a puzzle that is fitting together in a very, very conspiratorial way. And like you said in some of your notes to Richard, this frightens you. I know it does. So, anyways, let's take a break, and we'll come back on the other side and listen to more of what Daniel Kaiser has to say about the lost Malaysian flight.
As you're staring up at the night sky, ever wonder who's staring back? You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Daniel Kaiser, who is unraveling a scenario he and his team have put together that the lost Malaysian jet has in some way been commandeered and is now sitting someplace at a location taken by certain individuals for whatever reason. And he's putting together a theory that this jet, is sitting somewhere ready to be used in the future for some type of operation, I guess in a quote-unquote terrorist scenario. And I don't know about you, but if Daniel's theory is correct, is just a waiting game. And if in fact it's true, and all the facts seem to be pointing towards that, if this is true, we just have to be sitting and waiting for some sort of thing to unfold that is not very pleasant. And one of the things that Daniel did suggest is what this thing could be used for, to set off some sort of nuclear device over North America and knock out everything. And then within a year, we're all toast. Daniel, if you were to speculate, I'm going to ask you just to kind of think about the political implications of this, or what the politics or the military are doing right now, the politicos. Is it like a duck, sitting on water? Everything's sort of fine on the surface, but they're just treading water like hell to try to figure out what's going on, and they're just sort of scrambling behind the scenes to locate this thing, other than what's being portrayed on the media in terms of a search. What do you think the intelligence agencies at the highest level possible are doing right now?
Can I, let me see. Let me try 2 words for you, okay? Well, actually, there's going to be 4.
Okay.
One of them is CYA, okay? The second one is going to be plausible deniability.
Okay.
Okay. If you take those 2 factors, which most in almost all countries do, the first thing they do is they look at CYA. The second thing they do is look for plausible deniability. I think that there are factions in the global New World Order that have, how do I want to say it, insider information and control of many facets of countries in Europe, in the U.S., even in the China and Russia areas, and all through Saudi Arabia and all through that area. I think that there are forces to play here that are dark, that are deeper than what is on the surface, and I think that they're the ones that are making the choices. Have you ever read the book Manchurian?
Yes, I have, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. That kind of gives you the idea or concept of what can actually go on in a black ops situation, or what you call a deep cover situation. And with my years being involved with the OSI, we had several clandestine operations, including delivering, certain banned chemicals to certain factions in Southeast Asia. I'll put it that way so I don't get into too much trouble.
That's okay, yeah.
At the classified operation. But we, as young troops, did not know what we were doing. We were following orders. It wasn't until later that we understood what the silver canisters were.
I see.
And so this type of operation could easily take place in a black ops, nefarious sort of way. And I think it's been allowed to happen. I think it's been planned out. It looks too clean cut. I think they're doing the propaganda thing. One of the things, Victor, that I wanted to go through here was working on a master's degree for emergency and disaster management. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, which was sad for me, and I'm having a hard time dealing with it, especially with classes, that 70% of the emergency and disaster management focus is not on helping people. It's working with the political game, working with the local politicians, looking at who can make the most money, who can survive economically, and where can those funds be transferred to with the banking industry. That's what emergency and disaster management truly is about under FEMA. That's what I'm studying to do. And that really upsets me because people are like last on the list.
That is very disturbing. Because I guess what you're saying is that some of the things that have happened in the past have been they've been set up. And like Pearl Harbor, for example, or the Gulf of Tonkin, or even 9/11. There is a reasoning behind it happening other than the explanation that we've been given.
Absolutely. And I think, Victor, you're doing an outstanding job. I've never talked with anybody that is so in the know and has as much broad-based knowledge as you do. I commend you. Bravo.
Oh, thank you.
I believe sincerely that exactly what you just said. I think that this is exactly what is going on as a false flag, or preparing us for a false flag. Now, in my personal opinion, an opinion of not all my team, but the majority of my team, believes that the U.S. would be your primary target and Israel would be your secondary target. Now, several of the people in our group, and actually two of the gentlemen that we have in our group are actually from Israel. They feel that Israel is the primary target for this.
That's logical. Yeah, that's logical. Sure. I can see that.
One of the scenarios that absolutely made me cringe, and I sat back, as you said earlier, when I found this out, I sat back in my chair and I actually shook, was that if you take, see if I can put this in a scenario, I was hoping that we could put some pictures up so people could see what was there.
You know what, Daniel? Let me hold you there, okay? We've got to take a bit of a break, and on the other side we'll come back, and you can take some time to think about that, because we've just got one last break, and we can get back into it again, okay? Yeah. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show, and we're talking to Daniel Kaiser regarding the lost Malaysian flight. My name is Victor Vigiani, and stay with us.
It's time to redefine reality. This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
And welcome back. My name is Victor Vigiani, sitting in for Richard Syrett this week here on The Conspiracy Show. And we have on the line Daniel Kaiser, who is talking to us about the lost Malaysian flight that we've all been kind of inundated by over the past 3 weeks. And just want to sort of lay something on you very briefly, and it's a quote that I use in an article of mine, and it's very appropriate for right now. And it says, "Participation in the North American democracy is largely based on the belief that citizens should never be released into the world until they have been properly sedated." This is a quote taken from an unknown convocation address in university. Not only does it magnify the state of denial and ignorance in which a massive proportion of the North American population live, it is also an historical testament to the lies we are all prepared to accept for the sake of convenience. And I think what we're talking about tonight, having this jet, this Boeing 777, sit somewhere on the planet, ostensibly taken by terrorists to be used at another time as a weapon of mass destruction. We'll get a little bit more into that in a minute with Daniel, but I don't know about you, it really disturbs me. So, Daniel, you were going to make a point just before the break. Want to sort of expand upon it?
Yeah, what I was going to say is that we were talking about Israel, and we were talking about this as a weapons platform. For example, on our scenario 2, we had talked about it in scenario 1 as an EMP weapon, and we can go into that a little deeper here in a minute. Or scenario 2, whether it can be used because of the aircraft's large carrying capability, tonnage-wise, this aircraft technically could be filled with dirty waste, nuclear waste. And there has been reports, verified reports, that the nuclear waste dumping area in Siberia has been systematically raided by Muslim activists. So some of that highly radioactive material is beginning to be taken away or hauled off or whatever they're doing with it. Let's go back real quick, is that under this scenario, whether they're going to make a dirty bomb, they could easily fly over, blow this aircraft up with a full load of nuclear waste aboard the aircraft and basically make Tel Aviv and anything within 7-10 mile radius of Tel Aviv completely uninhabitable for the next 1,000 years. Or they could do that to New York, or they could do it to Montreal, or they could do it to Winnipeg, or they could do it to, the list goes on. It can be done to London. So that's a pretty terrifying type thing. You're going to get a lot of traction, but it's going to be in a localized area as far as the terror factor would be huge with them being able, with the terrorist group, to pull the dirty bomb type thing off. Now, if you really want to cut the head of the snake off, you go with scenario 1, and that's where you use it as an EMP weapon. Back in 1943, I believe, and somebody I'm sure will quote me if I'm wrong here on the date, there was a EMP test that was done in the South Pacific by the U.S. military with a 120 kiloton nuclear weapon that was exploded with an airburst that burnt out the street lights in Hawaii over 1,400 miles away. So within 1,400 miles with 120 megaton or kiloton rather nuclear weapon, and I think it was less. I think the altitude was at 1,500 feet. I'm sure somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, but it wasn't very high. And we got over 1,400 nautical miles. Street lights were blowing out. Communication systems were being knocked out. And even back then, in the late 40s, most of our equipment was pretty robust. It was pretty hardcore, heavy-duty type of stuff.
Right.
Not like the electronics we have today, which is extremely fragile. If you did the same EMP thing over Israel, I do not believe that. I think Israel has hardened their system, probably survived it. At least the military would have done that. So we have to switch the scenario back, and this is where I come in. I say, I think the U.S. is a major target. And my Israeli people say, no, it's us. But if you did this, let's say over Nebraska, and you had an altitude of less than a mile,
right.
Okay, you're at 5,000, 6,000, 4,000, 6,000 feet,
Mm-hmm.
and you used a 500 kiloton nuclear weapon, that would be one that has been proven that North Korea has, and one that could be developed by Iran. And you set that off, the EMP, the gamma radiation burst yield of that particular weapon system would turn the North American continent back to the days of horse and buggy in less than 15 seconds.
In less than, sorry?
Yeah, nothing would work.
My goodness.
Now, what that means, and people don't understand that, and your job and Richard's job is to make sure people wake up to what I'm talking about here. That's no sewer. That's no refrigerators. That's no grocery stores. That's no potable water. That's no traffic lights, no movies, no 911.
Nothing.
No air conditioning. That means no cell phones. And the real problem that we have, okay, if you want to back up what I'm saying here, do you remember the power outage back in the 70s?
Oh, yes, very well.
Okay, and the one that took out part of Canada and took out most of the United States?
Oh, yes.
That was just from an EMP pulse from the sun, and a minor one to boot. Take that and multiply that 100-fold. What do you think is going to happen to the Canadian people? Now, honestly, Canada, the Canadian people, probably in a much better situation. They're not quite as toys, not quite as spoiled rotten as Americans. But
yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Oh, you follow me? Okay, they're hardy. They're more like the Alaskan people. People in Alaska go, my power's off, so what? Okay, let's go out and do what we got to do and get her done. That's not going to happen in the U.S. At a 500 kiloton weapon going off at a mile or above the United States, central United States, most of Canada's major cities are going to be wiped out as far as electricity. Almost all of the United States will be wiped out. We will not get back our generators. We will not be able to it could be years to get power back. FEMA, in their records and their tests, and what they say is that within 1 year, 90% of the United States population will be dead from starvation, crime, and disease.
So you're saying that FEMA already has a scenario outlined as a result of this?
Yeah,
Is that...
yeah, absolutely. Yes, they do. The entire government of the United States of America, under martial law, will be transferred completely over to FEMA. FEMA will automatically take complete control of the U.S. government. There will be no elections. There will be nothing. All food production, all food production in the United States will belong to them. That includes the little garden plot on your deck, on your apartment where you're growing your tomatoes. That becomes immediately under the control of FEMA, Department of Homeland Security.
And they would take over as quote unquote the government.
Everything, absolutely, no elections. And we're talking about street. What was it? I'm trying to think of the movie where the Drudge. I think it was called Drudge, where they had street justice, where the cops could do street executions on the spot. That is what FEMA is prepared for. That is what will happen. If you do not comply, you will be eliminated.
Well, let me ask you then, if that's the scenario that FEMA seems to be having in its back pocket, could they use not the actuality of this event, could they use the threat of this event to insist on some type of martial law?
Yeah. Things start to get looking convoluted here. We here in the United States and South Carolina are missing 3 to 4 nuclear weapons that have been moved out by the so-called powers to be, administrative powers, not military, but administrative powers, have checked out 4 nuclear weapons. And we do not know we know 2 of them have been destroyed off the coast of the United States in a deep sea explosion. But there still are 2 missing. And where they ended up, nobody seems to know yet.
I see.
So if this is a government operation, and if they do want to take complete control and bring in FEMA and want to bring in the Department of Homeland Security, just like President Obama promised us back in 2008, that he wanted a civilian defense force under the control of the Department of Homeland Security, that he wanted it stronger than the U.S. military. Why do you believe that the Department of Homeland Security needs 16 billion rounds of ammunition?
Very good question.
My point made. So if you add these scenarios up with this weapons of mass destruction, this platform that's available to them, we've got tremendous worldwide attention to this plane that's missing. If this plane shows up and bombs Tel Aviv, or drops a nuke over Tel Aviv, or crashes into Tel Aviv, the world's going to know that it was a hijacker and that Al-Qaeda took care of it. 911. 911 went around the world. Now, if you want to take the head off the snake, and the United States, quote, unquote, is a snake, then you would do the EMP pulse thing over the United States. You would kill more Americans. You would get Americans. It would be a Mad Max scenario type of thing over the United States. And we are not prepared.
Well, I don't know what to make of all of this. It's almost like we're anticipating, as I said earlier, another 9/11 scenario. And you're outlining something so insidious, Daniel, that it pales all of the information that we've garnered so far. It makes virtually everything that I've heard about this scenario, the whole search and everything, just almost become irrelevant. And to be looking for a plane that didn't crash, and do all of that in the face of the possibilities that you're outlining. What if someone in the media did get a hold of this? Whoever might be listening now, what could they possibly do to bring this forward?
I think they should possibly, if they're a good investigative reporter, would be to contact people that you guys have in your circle of experts that have connections. Be able to put together a team or members a board that could go in front of the people of this world and get coverage, at least on the alternative media side. I do not believe that mainstream media would allow it. And so I do not think that mainstream media will happen. Mainstream media is working on, and the government is working on, the fact is that we are reactionary. We're not proactive. We are reactionary as far as people go.
Well, that's true, yes.
And the problem with this scenario is there is nothing to react to. There is no way to fix this. There is no way to pick up after this gets done. There is only survival. And you tell me, Victor, okay, and have your audience out there, they can come on and they can give me a hard time, and I'm going to say to them, straight up, everything that I've said here is technologically possible. Everything that I say here, history has dictated that this actually can be a scenario. As you said earlier, the Gulf of Tonkin, the false flags with Pearl Harbor. The list goes on and on. The United States government, in my opinion, murdered 3,000 people. Yeah, we
gotta cut you off there, Daniel. Sorry about that. We're right at the top of the hour, and I wish we could go on further with this. Radio's like that. I want to thank you Thank you, Juana, for joining us this evening, and we'll talk again soon.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
This evening has been a pleasure, and I want to thank you all for listening very much. Please check out the Richard Syrett website, richardsyrett.com. My name is Victor Bigiani. Thank you very much for being with us. Good night.